David Cameron has warned the rest of the European Union that should the Conservatives win the next election in 2015, he'll be pressing for a renegotiation of Britain's membership of the EU, followed by an in-out UK referendum in 2017. It's a big demand, potentially involving many months of debate between Europe's 28 member states. This week, one enterprising think tank decided it was time to start rehearsing for such a daunting diplomatic challenge. It brought together a team of European players in a conference room at Westminster, provided them with plenty of caffeine, and let the world tonight in to watch what it called the EU War Games. It's the year 2017. The new British government is calling for a renegotiation of the UK's membership of the European Union. And other EU members have said, yes, they're ready to talk. That's the premise of this EU war game in a conference room just minutes from the Palace of Westminster. The Open Europe think tank has gathered together 8 key European players from Britain and Ireland to Germany, France, Spain and Italy, Poland and the Nordic states for a frank and sometimes tense discussion before a live audience. Will the British, represented by high-flying Conservative MP Andrea Leadsom, persuade the others to keep Britain in on new terms?
What we're here to do today is to look at the fact that the European Union's day, its best days, could be behind us. And therefore, we need to think very seriously about where the EU goes from here.
I represent France today, so I should speak in French. I would hate to speak in English, but for the sake of the debate, I'll I'll speak in English this morning.
Saying that the Netherlands shares a large part of the analysis of the UK, and we do believe that some issues are better left to national parliaments.
On behalf of Sweden in particular, but Nordics in general as well, in terms of a possible treaty change, do we think that it's inevitable in the coming 10, 20 years? Probably not.
And to be very clear about the British approach, we are not interested in renegotiating the British membership in Europe.
Well, the negotiating sessions on the future of the European Union have run over time, and I think that's entirely realistic. And the world tonight is gathering together some of the participants to look more closely at what Britain would want from EU renegotiation and what she might get. So I have with me Britain's voice at this war game table, Conservative MP and co-founder of the Fresh Start project, Andrea Leadsom, the former Irish Taoiseach and EU ambassador to the United States, John Bruton. And John, you're here today speaking both for Ireland and the EU Commission, which has been interesting, and for France, Vivien Pertusot, who is head of the Brussels office for the French Institute for International Relations. There is a lot to deal with. So Andrea, first, we'll take 3 of the key aims that Britain would have. Not the whole negotiating deal, but you pointed to 3 particular aims. First, let's talk about what you'd be asking for in order to make a more globally competitive European Union.
Yeah, well, the big issue that we have is that the EU, as things stand, is in long-term decline. Its share of global trade is declining at a rate of knots. Obviously, there are enormous unemployment problems, not just in the UK, which are gradually reversing, but very profound problems in some of the European member states. Those things have to be addressed. So one of our key requirements is for far greater focus on global competitiveness. That means things like prioritising the EU-US free trade agreement and negotiating many, many more free trade agreements. But very importantly, it also means completing the single market for services, which is an area that the EU has singularly failed to do. It's very good on trade in goods within the EU, but not good on trade in services. So we want to see a lot of progress towards that.
Vivien, how does this sound to French ears, the British focus on a more open, more globally competitive EU?
Well, in general, we agree with that in France. The idea of a more open and competitive Europe, this is in our interests. So this is fine. When we look at the detail of what Andrea just mentioned, we may have some disagreements on the EU-US free trade agreement. We are all in favor of it. It's just that when we look in details, we may have some issues, especially regarding agriculture, defense, services as well, for instance. I mean, those are some of the issues that we have problems with. So yes, free trade agreements could be a solution, but then we need to be very careful about the kind of concessions that we make.
And therein, John Bruton, lies a fundamental tension, doesn't it, for Ireland as well, between open markets and the need to protect your own?
Well, I think the decline of Europe, Japan and North America relative to the rest of the world is due to much bigger forces than the existence or non-existence of the European Union. If we were 28 separate countries capable of devaluing our currencies one against the other, we would probably be far further on the road to decline than we are by being 28 together, capable of doing things together and creating, at least imperfectly, but a lot more of a single market than would have been the case if we had no European Union. I think that's one of our strengths, is our single market. I'm particularly worried as an Irish person about the possibility of Britain withdrawing from the European Union, because that would mean that we would have to reintroduce customs controls, not just across the Irish Sea, but within Ireland along the border, which is a very porous and long border and difficult to police. And it also would mean, potentially, if one wants to keep, for example, citizens from Romania or Bulgaria entering the UK through the EU member that would still be Ireland, it could mean the introduction for the first time in history of actual passport controls on the border in Ireland.
So you would be keen to help Britain in these negotiations to keep her within.
We're keen to help Britain within but respecting the treaty commitments which Britain has negotiated. All of the existing EU treaties are legal requirements, and obviously the European Commission has the responsibility of ensuring that everything is done in accordance with the treaties, or that the treaties are changed. But the difficulty with changing the treaties is that requires all 28 members to agree. It was easier to get a treaty change when there are only 6 countries in the European Union. But with 28, all you need is one to say no.
Well,
that
let's
can be
bring
difficult.
that back to Andrea Leadsom, because Andrea, speaking for Britain in this war game scenario, you've made the point that there are issues about which the British feel very strongly, for example, reform of things like the Working Time Directive, welfare tourism, and these things may have to be sorted out by treaty change or not, but that would be the kind of thing you'd be talking about late into the night.
That's right. Well, I mean, on this subject of treaty change, John's not quite right to say that the treaties are absolutely hard and fast and can't be changed. Of course they can. There's plenty of examples of member states who've broken treaty obligations. So, it's not true to say that there's no flexibility. But I think the absolutely key point is that British people are sick and tired of some of the stupidity of the European Union that are often the result of poor negotiations in the past. And to simply say, well, you signed up to it, so you better lump it, is just a nonsense. People do want to see free movement of labour, but not free movement of access to benefits. That should be for member states to decide whether, if you come here as a welfare tourist, whether you're actually entitled to that or not. And British people would say absolutely not.
And yet in the debate that we've had so far, we've heard several other voices around the table saying the free movement of people is fundamental to the European Union. And the phrase was used, will the EU just wither away if you start going down this road?
And that's just a nonsense. I mean, the logical extension of free movement of labour is you could end up with 600 million people living in the UK, the entire population of the EU. That's not what was intended by it. Free movement of labour was to support the single market, to ensure that we build GDP in all of our countries, to ensure that we're globally competitive and so on. It was never intended to be the means by which, let's say, a Bulgarian neurosurgeon decides to come to the UK to practice neurosurgery here against the interests of Bulgarian civilians, and simply because he can earn as much here in a day as he does in a month in Bulgaria. That's the logical extension of this policy, and it has to change.
Vivien Pertusot, I'm aware we're trying to cover an awful lot in a short period of time, but there is obviously, from Andrea's point of view, a great British appetite for fundamental change. Now, if you're looking at things like the laws of employment, the laws of benefit claimants, those kind of shake-ups, are they acceptable to France?
No, they're not acceptable for a very simple reason. Is when you start détricoter, unwinding all the things that have been done before, then the EU starts to unravel. And I have to disagree with you on this. I mean, the things that when you start, it may be a small issue, but then it opens a Pandora's box, and it's a never-ending issue, because we start with benefits, and then we start with the freedom of movement, the freedom of goods, the freedom. If you open this door, there's no turning back.
John, can I put it to you, with your hat on here at the War Games, representing the EU Commission and the EU Parliament, you would be in great difficulties, wouldn't you, with that tension between fundamental reform and we can reform from within?
Well, I don't really agree that on a fundamental matter one can simply ignore the treaties. And, one of the things that marks our civilization here in Europe is the respect for the rule of law.
You could say that's an argument for stagnation, though.
No, it's not. It's an argument for making changes by agreement. We can change the treaties, but we need all 28 countries to agree. One country can't change the treaty for itself without affecting others. And talk about benefit tourism. You have a very large number of British citizens living in Spain who can benefit from health services in that country because they're part of the European Union, and that's guaranteed. They can't be discriminated on grounds of nationality. Well, equally, one can't discriminate against Romanians on ground of nationality. In Ireland, 14% of our social benefits are paid to EU citizens who are not citizens of our country, a large number of them UK citizens, actually. And we can't take that away, and there's no controversy about that in Ireland. What surprises me is that there is this controversy in this country about immigrants, where proportionately of EU immigrants, we have a lot more in Ireland.
I'm going to get a final thought on how much backing Britain might have if, in this war game, or in 2017, the Conservatives are the biggest party or majority party in Britain, and we're talking about Britain renegotiating its terms of membership. First, Vivien Pertusot, you're here speaking for France in this scenario. How much backing do you think the Brits would get?
It all depends the kind of renegotiation the Brits want to put on the table. If the idea is to disintegrate the EU, then France will probably not give a lot of backing to Britain, even if it's presented as a reform of the whole of the EU. But if the reforms are very mild and we're talking about a few things within the internal market or improve the competitiveness of the EU, why not? But we have to be careful. For France, what's very important is to strengthen the Eurozone, and if Britain wants basically to refrain by different ways, not directly but indirectly to refrain the integration of the Eurozone, France will not let that happen.
But Andrea Leadsom, if you were representing Britain in these talks, the scenario we have, you'd be feeling pretty lonely, wouldn't you?
Actually, no. I think there's a huge amount of support. And as I've discovered in my visits to European member states, different member states like different ideas. This isn't about Britain renegotiating Britain's terms of membership. This is about Britain facing up to the fact, as a leader in the European Union, that the EU itself needs to reform. Otherwise, its days are over. And that's the really, I think, key point about today's exercise.
I was hearing there from Vivien Pertusot for France, former Irish Taoiseach John Bruton and the British Conservative MP Andrea Leadsom.